Recently, there's been quite a controversy in Northern Ontario about the extensive use of glyphosate pesticide spraying in our northern forests. There's legitimacy of this concern. So I thought it might be a good time for Earthroots to do a recap, a background on the origins of glyphosate and how it came to be used in the forest. For that story to start, one has to go back to the 1970s when glyphosate first came on the scene as an agricultural pesticide. What was unique about glyphosate is it was a herbicide that killed basically all plants. It wouldn't necessarily kill everything dead, but the vast majority of weeds certainly were killed dead. And this was useful to agriculture because at the same time the agribusiness was producing a genetically modified crop called Roundup Ready corn, and ultimately Roundup Ready soybeans, and later Roundup Ready wheat. What Roundup Ready meant was that it was genetically altered, that crop was genetically altered, such that it has a resistance to the toxic effects of glyphosate. Obviously very useful, because then you could plant corn and spray the land with glyphosate and it would kill everything except the corn, and hence the soybeans the same thing once it was genetically modified. So it was a very successful, and to this day, a very successful and necessary function of industrialized agriculture, and that vast quantities of glyphosate is poured on corn and soybeans. Not so much wheat though, because wheat that was modified genetically was frowned upon by the third world and won't be bought. So basically they've given up Roundup Ready wheat in North America because they can't sell it overseas. However, they did come up with a clever plan to what they call desiccate ripening wheat that is not Roundup Ready, to accelerate the maturity and dry out the grains of wheat by spraying glyphosate on the outside of the crops, and hence generated another big use for glyphosate, one that may or may not have implications to the large number of people who all of a sudden developed celiac-like sensitivity to bread and other commodities. But leaving that aside, so we had hugely successful glyphosate used in agriculture in vast quantities, in both as a Roundup Ready crop production and also as desiccation. And now we have the extension of use of glyphosate. They found, well, we can spray it in the forest for conifer release. What is conifer release? Well, when you cut down a pine and spruce forest in northern Ontario for the lumber, or the pulp as it were, what grows back from these clear cuts in this kind of operation, a forestry operation we have now, is not the pine and spruce that was originally cut, and even in the mixed stand. What happens is that the hardwoods, such as two species of poplar and white birch, grow in vast numbers quickly, as well as all sorts of brushy, smaller species, choke cherries and various things. And those stifle the growth of the pine and spruce, which may be naturally regenerated or planted on those lands and are intended to be the ultimate crop. So they don't do well because they're shaded out by the hardwoods, and unless they're giving a leg upwards. Well, a leg upwards is to spray the lands that have been cut and suppress or kill all the poplar and birch and wild cherry and various things, thus releasing and letting the sunlight penetrate down to the young pines and young spruce and releasing them. They call it conifer release, and giving them a leg up and get above the shade of the other trees, and ultimately, and they figure in the long run, they'll have another pine and or spruce forest to cut. So that's the intent. But of course, glyphosate is a toxic herbicide, and it functions by disrupting a certain enzyme pathway. That's hard science, don't worry about that. But suffice to say, they say, well, it's kind of harmless, because humans don't have that enzyme pathway, so we couldn't possibly affect humans. Well, not directly, perhaps. So mammals don't have the enzyme pathway, but microbes do. And we're full of microbes as humans. and so are other forest creatures full of microbes. And if they are affected by the glyphosate, then that has deleterious impacts that must be considered. As well, of course, just the straightforward herbicide effects of killing blueberries and other crops and other plant activity, other minor plants in the forest, changes the fundamental character of the forest. So the indigenous people who are protesting these glyphosate spraying have right to be concerned. They are right. It's their land and it's being harmed and disrupted by massive spraying of glyphosate. So this has to be given more thought. And yes, there are concerns about losing our pine and spruce forests over time, but what is the priority? The health of our ecosystem and our indigenous populations who reside on that land, or some thought about the long-term effects of the forest industry? Some food for thought.